Morning, good afternoon, good evening, wherever you are in the world. Please thank you for joining me today for the SMIE Consulting Midweek Roundup. It's Wednesday, February 1st, 2023, and today on the Roundup we're going to be answering 3 questions we've been hearing from international educators over the last week. We'll get into the questions in just a moment, but I want to say obviously thank you to those of you who are joining me live for our weekly chat here on Facebook, LinkedIn, Twitter, and YouTube, simulcast across all 4 channels. And each week we go in depth into 3 themes we've been seeing developing in certain news stories we see each week in international education. And we start off each week with the source of those news stories. We have our newsletter, all the SMIE news fit to share. And in case you're wondering, that SMIE stands for Social Media and International Education Consulting. That's the name of the business. And I've been running this newsletter for over 4.5 years, as well as this live chat to cover the kinds of issues that I think are most relevant to our international education family. So there are 3 quick links I'll be posting in the chat on Facebook and YouTube here, and those are for the subscribe page on our newsletter on the website, smieconsulting.org/subscribe. That's the first link, where if you prefer an email version of the newsletter that covers all the top social media stories and international ed stories from around the world and, of course, the United States that impact what we do in international education. So all of those news stories will be available that you can subscribe by going to the web link that I've just dropped for SMIE Consulting. I've also put the link to the most recent edition of that newsletter that you can get via email. But if you also prefer to get your international ed news on LinkedIn, you can subscribe to the newsletter at the link that is provided for this past Monday's edition. So we've now crossed 1,000 subscribers, a combination of our web-based and our LinkedIn version of the newsletter. So thank you for making that a weekly part of your international edification. It's really a pleasure to be coming to you each week. Monday for the news summary in our newsletter, and then Wednesdays here on the live chat. So we've had some folks joining the live chats in the comments section recently. So if you're out there and you have any thoughts on any of the topics that we're going to cover today, certainly feel free to do so, and we'll give you a quick shout out. But I also want to thank those that take the time to download our audio-only podcast version of the Roundup for your listening pleasure, for walking, working out, or just getting through your day, filling that void between calls and meetings. So thanks very much for making us a part of your International Edification Week. So let's get right into our first question of the day. And it is an interesting one. We haven't covered this much here on the Roundup over the last few months, but it's one that's growing in popularity, and it's growing primarily because of the pandemic that has certainly exposed a lot of institutions to changes in the way that they operate, and in terms of the way they teach their classes. All of these things have been accelerating since the pandemic, and that is the question of, will online education options for international students grow? Now, this is a particularly interesting topic in that we know, for those of us who have been on the international student advising side or student services side of the desk, pre-pandemic, there was a limit to 1 online class per term that international students could take during their each academic semester, a quarter, year, whatever it might be. So that limit during the pandemic, we know, was temporarily set aside, and that there was an exemption given starting in March of 2020 for international students enrolled in the United States at that time to be exempt from having to take be limited to only 1 online class, just because of the nature of the pandemic was changing fundamentally the way educational classes were being taught on college campuses, and in turn most everybody went virtual during the early days of that pandemic. So this topic of will online educational opportunities for online education expand for international students is an interesting one, because of that kind of sort of Damocles that's hanging over international students' head, that if if and when the Department of Homeland Security decides to go back to the original policy. If they do go back, then it's going to raise a number of challenges for institutions who's have a number of courses that have that are part of their curriculums or entire degrees that are offered online only now, and that would present a real problem for any international students that are currently or would be in wanting to enroll in those. So that might prohibit them entirely if they're coming new from overseas to begin a completely online program, to physically be in the United States. So under current F1 regulations, if we go back to the way they were. So this is the challenge that we face. And I've posted 3 links to stories that are surrounding this issue. One is about Arizona State, already a big player on the global stage internationally. It's one of the top I think they're in the top 5 or 6, top 5 institutions for international students in terms of volume. I think they're looking right now at over 15,000 international students on campus from the 2022 Open Doors report. So there may be more than that now. They probably had a really good fall based on what conversations I've had with the colleagues there. But they are entering into this space. They already had a fairly robust partnership program that allowed Arizona State students to take degrees at campus partners overseas. Now they're expanding more into the online world with this an approach that is potentially a game changer. We all remember MOOCs when MOOCs took off in popularity around in the late noughties and early teens, how important they are, as they were seen as a kind of a bellwether of change in the way educational institutions deliver courses. The massive online open courses, the MOOCs. To this day, we see data from some of the providers like edX and Coursera that, in terms of their numbers, how they've changed over the years, and particularly during the pandemic. But this Arizona State story is they're going to be leveraging YouTube to deliver for-credit classes for as low as $400 per course. And this is their way to get into the market of potentially the massification of their courses being available to a wider range of students of academic ability. And hello, Jink. Good to see you back on the chat. And certainly, ASU is a pioneer in a lot of ways in international education. But with this online piece that will now be leveraging YouTube to deliver their classes for credit, that has some real interesting potential, and it's going to be one to watch as we move forward. Now, a lot of international students' access to this will be, obviously anyone can access YouTube and potentially register for this class. So, the challenges will be in if an entire degree or courses that are being delivered specifically to students in other countries, that there are some compliance questions that get raised. And we're very fortunate. I've mentioned in the past at UNLV, where I work currently, we have an Office of Educational Compliance that is fully versed in what it means for us to be able to deliver our degrees in other countries and the challenges that we need to and hurdles we need to overcome in each of the various countries that we might be looking at when it comes to recognition of a degree or program that we might offer in country, virtually or in person, whether we are tax implications of us being in country in terms of the cost of education and delivery of services in country, other recognition issues, employment law, and all these other things that we need to be well versed in. This is kind of a discussion on compliance issues arise whenever institutions start talking about having in-country representation by having an employee represent their university in another country, and that oftentimes the institutions who have tried this and tried to figure out all the implications on their own often realize this can be a very cumbersome, bureaucratic nightmare of a job trying to manage that in terms of payments and tax laws and all the other implications for any employee that's hired to represent you in country. So you see existing companies that have other related services now step up and say, hey, I'm Career Mosaic in India. Market Entry is one of our brands, and we can provide universities in-country representation for a fee, basically paying for all the overhead and that business in country is already established in that country could then do the hiring. So as it applies to online education, that's just an example of some of the issues that come into play when we're talking about how online ed might be impacted by for international students. Now, this is something that in other countries, the UK, Australia in particular, are particularly good at. I've shared before how transnational education, something that the British and the Aussies do very well, much better than we do. Britain educates or issues more degrees and has more students studying in British courses outside of the UK than they do inside the UK. I think it was 1.5 million last year. We're partaking in transnational education, either online or in physical mortar-based bricks and mortar structures in other countries, or through partner universities that these British universities have established in other nations. So there are versions of transnational education that already include online options that other countries are doing. And it's up to individual institutions that are intentional about where they might deliver their online classes. So we're kind of dividing this conversation into two pieces. We talked about earlier about international students in the United States who want to have the on-campus experience but have to take, because of the nature of the courses during the pandemic and immediately after, that have turned online or have gone exclusively online or in part online. Those students are potentially in jeopardy if and when DHS goes back to the pre-pandemic ruling on one online class per term. So hopefully that we see some evolution in government policy in that regard. But if on the other side of it, for international students that we know during the pandemic, many of them returned home and then took classes either asynchronously or synchronously to get the content that they need to keep their progress towards graduation. So we'll see what happens in that regard for future of international students' ability to continue to take online classes after the pandemic is officially over, or whoever knows when that happens. But what we'll see is the challenges will be with twofold. There's obviously the regulatory challenges we'll have to deal with if they do go back to the pre-pandemic regulations. And then for those of us who want to offer our courses virtually in other countries and target specific markets, you'll need to do your research on what you need to know to set up officially in country and deliver online courses. We've seen this week that China has renounced its acceptance of online courses that its students can take, that Chinese students that have been taking courses virtually either in Australia, UK, Canada, or the US or elsewhere. Those are no longer going to be possible, that those Chinese students who came back home during the pandemic will now need to get back into the countries that they had planned to or were already taking degrees and get physically back in country. So China is renouncing their recognition of these online classes, so students won't be able to do that anymore. Chinese students that will qualify, those classes won't be recognized if they come back to China with those degrees, if they continue to do online classes. It may be offered, but they won't be recognized if they continue to do that. So we'll see what happens in that respect, because it's a moving target depending on which country you're in, depending on the region, depending on maybe the program. If it's even the individual programs would need to be recognized, not just the institution. So there's a lot of moving parts in this. But will online education option grow? And the clear news and the one piece in this story is the World Economic Forum link, which is the second of the three that I posted. That provides a really interesting snapshot of where the interest is for online education. And it's been growing substantially. You look at just Coursera. This is the demand for online courses through Coursera has grown from in 2019 pre-pandemic 44 million to 2021 over 92 million, so doubled during the pandemic, and that is just seen as just quite remarkable in terms of that growth. And where are those learners coming from? And again, these are the top 10 countries with the most learners that are on the Coursera platform, as an example of where the volume is. United States is number one because it's, of course, Coursera is a U.S. product. 17.3 million in the United States. India is next with 13.6 million. Mexico third with 4.8 million. Brazil in fourth with 3.7 million. And China 3.3 million now. And I'm sure those numbers will be dropping precipitously in the next few weeks and months. Canada is sixth at 2.4 million. Russia 2.4. UK 2.4. Colombia 2.2. And Egypt 1.6 million. So those are the number of users that are currently on Coursera in those individual countries that are taking online classes. So this is just an example of giving you the kind of some of the data points that you might be looking at if this is something your institution is going to be exploring. If you want to be targeting certain countries, where those students are, and then once you know, perhaps there's some other data that I know one of the service providers we work with, Study Portals, has an incredible data set on interest levels in different countries and where the supply is not keeping supply of available places in university for certain courses is not meeting the demand. So that's going to be one to watch as well. So if you have access to the Study Portals data, that would be one to get as well, to give you a very clear picture of what to expect. Now, when we talk about online learning, it's oftentimes thought of as as almost secondary. We learned during the pandemic that it's actually essential, but there are ideas of online learning that actually complement what we try and do with international education, particularly at institutions where, for example, if you're trying to get more of your institution students to consider international options, if they don't have a lot of study abroad interest or ability to participate in programs, something like COIL, Collaborative Online International Learning. This is something that we've seen grow dramatically over the last 3 or 4 years in certain countries, particularly Mexico. There's been huge push to expand COIL offerings between institutions in Mexico and in the United States. I attended a conference in October where this was the theme for the entire conference, is COIL, and what the outcomes of those stories are. There's a Pi News story that I've linked that shares exactly what the data is suggesting, that students that are at institutions where there aren't a lot of options are more impacted in a positive way when it comes to thinking internationally and developing a hunger for exploring international more if they don't have anything else like a formal study abroad programs, that participation in a COIL program these are 6-week programs between 2 institutions in different countries that really focus on whatever the topic of that class is, go really in depth, give you the different perspectives from the different cultures, and that is where students who don't have other options on campus, that's where they really see a lot of growth and thinking about what international might mean. So if your campus doesn't have a huge abundance of these kind of programs, traditional study abroad programs, summer, short-term, semester-long programs, then COIL might be a way to go to at least start generating that interest. And the Pi News article covers a lot of those details in terms of what the data shows for how that can be a real value to your institution. That might be another piece in the internationalization puzzle that you're trying to develop. So online education is going to continue to grow, in my opinion, and the market for it is going to be there. The supply certainly is not meeting the demand right now in a lot of areas. So I think there's going to be great potential moving forward for institutions to move into this area. Related to that topic on the international student growth in the United States, we have seen this past week SEVIS. They ended up doing this. Obviously, our friends at DHS, they are political beasts. They operate in a very sensitive world in terms of regulations, what they can say, what they can't say. And the second question today is, what does the SEVIS by the numbers report tell us? They've just issued one in January that takes into account the intakes we've seen. It's real-time data when it's published each time they do. Last August at the EdUSA Forum, we'd seen an update in the spring, and I asked the DHS officers that were there from SEVP, will there be another SEVIS by the numbers in the fall? What can we expect? Oh, they said it's probably just going to be a once-a-year thing. And clearly that didn't happen because they did a couple in the fall, and now they've done one in January too. So at least they got the message realizing that we need this kind of data. And for those that aren't familiar, SEVIS by the numbers takes the data from active applicants or active students that have entered the United States that are in valid F1 status across the range of categories. So this also includes down to primary school, high school, vocational education, ESL training, associates, bachelor's, master's, doctoral level training. So all active F1 students are in this mix, in this report. So SEVIS, FNMs actually. So there's about 30,000 vocational only students in the United States, another couple thousand in flight schools, that type of thing. But in terms of this report, it's put out irregularly, but a couple, 3 times a year maybe. That does give you snapshots of where we are right now in January for international student numbers in the United States. Now, the SEVIS by the numbers report is not a user-friendly site, and I'll be putting the links to both the ICIF Monitor report, which is the main focus for why I'm bringing this up today, that shares that we are back over 1 million international students in the United States, first time since before the pandemic, and that's encouraging. After we saw obviously a lot of drop-offs, the continued drop-offs of Chinese students, obviously that accelerated during the pandemic because they were the most restricted in terms of their movements, that we didn't get the students coming that we were supposed to have been getting, in addition to the already declining trend in Chinese students coming. So the two links I've just dropped are the ICIF Monitor report, as well as the actual link to the SEVIS by the numbers site that has the data for this current January 2023 term. Now, as I mentioned, it's not a user-friendly database in terms of it's just a spreadsheet that you have to scroll down through, and it doesn't have any export features, so basically you have to cut and paste. And I do this fairly regularly whenever these reports come out. I usually spend some time. So the data reports are that there are 1,084,347 total active students in the United States from the 226 countries and territories and more that are in the database now. Now, in terms of volume, we see the two that you would expect to see at the top of the list, India and China, are right there. So in terms of where they are, we saw in the fall, when the fall numbers came up, we saw numbers in terms of total active students, the difference between India and China was down to about 45,000. I think it was 290 for China and 245 for India, or 250 for India. And that was from, I think, the October or November report. So the current report shows that gap has narrowed to only 9,000 now. So with 262,000 Chinese students, so a continued drop. We've seen Chinese students drop 29% in the last 3 years. We've seen Indian students increase 30% in the last year. So we're down to 262,992 Chinese and 253,631 Indian. Now, guarantee you by the fall intake, the Indian numbers will surpass the Chinese numbers, and we will have, for the first time since 2004-05, I think it is, more Indian students studying in the United States than Chinese. There may well be rebound in Chinese students, but it's not going to be anytime soon, and certainly not in the volume that we've experienced, certainly from the mid-noughties to the mid-teens. That 10-year span just saw an explosion of Chinese undergraduates everywhere in the United States. Many college campuses, particularly the big state schools, UNLV included, starting in 2014-15, we might have peaked and then started dropping off, and I've still seen continued declines accelerated by the pandemic from China. And as an institution that's looking to diversify, we certainly don't want to lose our base. And China is an important part of our base on campus, and it may be on many other college campuses, particularly on larger state institutions. But we certainly need to maintain many of those ties that we had, and start to restart and look for other avenues where we can be expanding our operations in China, and partnerships and other pathways for Chinese students to find us, and other countries as well. But when it comes to numbers, sheer volume, you can't get away from India and China. They're the two 800-pound gorillas in the room. And India in particular, their growth rate, we've seen the demographic story last week about China, how they had their first drop in populations in over 50 years in China, and the outlook is not looking great for growth, for return to growth in terms of college-age populations, just because of the cumulative impacts of the one-child policy over the years. That we know that's been dropped recently, but that'll be another 10, 15 years before we see any fruits of that labor. But we also see in China, as opposed to India's population is continuing to surge. India, not only in terms of international students in the United States, will overtake China this year. There's almost no doubt in my mind that will happen. But in world population terms, India's population will surpass China's this year as well, if it hasn't already. So India will be the largest player for the foreseeable future in terms of international student numbers in the United States, and predictions of doubling or tripling the number of Indians studying abroad happening in the next couple of years. So that market is just going to explode everywhere, much like China did in the mid-noughties. But not at the same level, at the undergrad level, that we saw in the U.S. At that point, because though the Indian undergraduate market is growing substantially, it's the undergraduate inbound population to the U.S. may take a little bit longer to see significant volume growth, but it is growing in the right direction, and we've talked about that here as well. So the numbers do show a lot of interesting tidbits in terms of outside the top two. So we look at China and India with both more than 250,000 international students in the United States. The top 10, coincidentally, we see this roughly the same number, and this is where we get into a little bit of differences in terms of open doors versus the SEVIS by the numbers report. If you notice in the ISIF Monitor report, it had a list of the top 10 countries, or I think it was the top 10. Yeah, and the numbers that are in the United States now, I think we've got the top 10 that are listed there. The data that's in the ISIF Monitor report is actually different than what's in the SEVIS by the numbers report. They may have cut out some of the categories and just looked at the higher ed numbers, didn't look at the undergraduate number or high school or IEP numbers, but we see a lot of differences. The top 10 that are displayed on this ISIF Monitor report are the same pre and post pandemic, but the orders have changed. After China and India, which are still the same right now, South Korea is still third. We see Saudi Arabia has dropped from 4th down to 10th. Brazil is the same. Vietnam is the same. Canada has increased to 4th position. Vietnam is in 6th position. Taiwan is a little bit of a bump, but that's more for Japan continuing to drop, and also Saudi Arabia continuing to drop. So you see a lot of interesting changes. In Nigeria, for all the problems that we've heard reported on visa issuance, they've had an increase from 16,000 to 19,400 since pre and post pandemic in that 3-year span from January 2020 to January 23. So data is certainly showing a lot of positives. Diversification of where outside the top 10 is certainly happening in terms of where those students are. But we'll certainly keep everybody up to speed in terms of what that will continue to look like in the days and weeks and months to come. Now, in terms of our last question of the day, what do you do about transfer outs down under? Now, here's an interesting one. A lot of my colleagues in the ISS world have shared many times over the last 4 or 5 years the challenges that they have with regards to students coming to their institutions, all excited, them issuing I-20s, record numbers of applicants, and all of these fun anecdotal stories I keep hearing. And you get the problem where within a week of the start of class to a couple days after the start of class, they don't show up. You get calls or emails saying they want to transfer to another institution without ever enrolling at your institution. And the way SEVIS is set up, we know that they legally are able to do that. And you have to basically facilitate that as a school that is receiving the student who issued the documents that student used to get into the country. If the student comes in and decides before they enroll that they want to go somewhere else before the semester begins, they can do that. And you have to transfer their record to the new institution. And at some schools, you would see, we saw this in Washington State a year or two ago, where there was waves of Bangladeshis coming in and then all of a sudden transferring out without ever showing up on campus or disappearing into the woodwork completely. That caused DHS and the SEVP field reps to have all the Washington schools come to a virtual meeting and be called out on the carpet and warned about what to look for and all these things about how to prevent that. I've just read the story this past week. It's in the chat now. It's from Pi News, again, my favorite source on international ed topics each week, particularly on the global level. They do great work in Australia, UK, Canada as well. But this story is entitled "Australian Universities Renew Calls to Limit Student Poaching." And it's a call by universities to the government saying the government should extend the time an international student must spend at the institution they initially join before they can switch providers. And a couple of institutions in particular, Queensland University of Technology and the University of Wollongong, recommended the government restrict the ability to transfer for international students. So currently, and here's what my U.S. friends will love. Currently, students must complete 6 months of study before they can transfer to a different institution. And the course they transfer to must be the same level as their previous one. And how many of you out there on the U.S. side, I was at an institution that I joined to kind of clean up a mess that had been created one time where there were at one point 150 transfer outs in a semester. And that was just before I got there, and that was a particular challenge. We would get students, we'd admit to bachelor's degree we would admit to master's degree programs that the students would come in, and then we'd find out that they want to transfer out and they want to transfer to a bachelor's degree program. So students that are going back in time, back in their educational progress. So very dodgy in terms, to say the least. But in terms of what's allowed, that was still, within SEVIS terms, that was allowed and we couldn't prevent it. But in Australia, they have to wait right now. The existing regulations are that they have to wait 6 months before they can transfer. These universities want to extend that time and prevent students from transferring either from maybe even something as significant, and they don't go into details in this report, but they use it as a way to get in the door and then disappear into the woodwork. Maybe go from a highly regarded university to a vocational program, or go from a master's degree to a bachelor's degree, a second bachelor's degree, a lower cost degree, which is oftentimes the motivating factor. So the quote from the article that I look at is, you see, the majority of providers work collaboratively and in the interests of the student to ensure this process is transparent and supportive. There are a small number of providers, agents, and students that seek to use this system to transfer once onshore for reasons other than educational outcomes. And whilst this is a small minority, it undermines the integrity of the system. So that is something that universities are apparently struggling with in Australia, that that 6 months apparently is not long enough for most universities. And what do you do with a student who wants to transfer after 6 months because they're not doing well, or no, they've just changed their major and they don't like your institution because it doesn't provide the level of services that they need? Could have very valid reasons for wanting to transfer. But so that I know for many of my U.S. colleagues, when we read this, we're just going, they get to wait a whole semester or 6 months before they can transfer. They go, genius. Let's have some more of that, because that is something that we in the U.S. The amount of effort that goes into recruiting a student, to getting them to come, to getting them into the country, and then you're all excited and ready for them to enroll, and then they transfer out. And then here's another one, and another 10, another 20, another 30. And then that's just demoralizing for international offices. But to see that our Australian brothers and sisters are having a little bit of agita when they have to wait. They want more than 6 months before a student can transfer out. So very interesting to see that coming out of Australia. But that's all we have for you today on the Roundup. I do appreciate those of you who stuck with me for the half hour here, and we do appreciate you being a part of the SMIE Consulting International Education family. And we look forward to chatting with you again next week. Next week, I will give you a little heads up. I'm going to be on campus at University of Nevada, Las Vegas, and hopefully have a minute or two to do a quick preview and give you a little insight as to what's going on the UNLV campus at this time. So thanks very much for being with part of the conversation today, and we look forward to chatting again soon. Cheers.